Hey everybody, we're going to talk about texture in our brush palette right now. If you hit B on your keyboard, that will select your brush tool. And so if we look at texture, we're going to click on the label, the label texture, and that'll bring us to the editing uh, panel here, the editing dialog. And basically, what happens with texture is Photoshop looks at a bitmap that you tell it to look at, and it takes the value information, the grayscale information of that bitmap, which is usually tileable, and it uses that grayscale information to determine whether or not to lay color down on your canvas. And so it works kind of like an alpha channel, and if you don't know what an alpha channel is, don't worry about it. We'll explain that. I'll go through alpha channels in a later video. But needless to say, areas that are white or a lighter value will deposit color on your canvas. Areas in the texture that are black will prevent um, color from being laid down on your canvas. So if we look at this texture here, you'll notice there's a lot of white in it and some black speckles. So here, let me delete this again. I'll delete this here. And so when I start painting, you'll notice that there's a lot of color. That's been most of the brush. When I make a brush stroke, it lays down mostly color, with a few areas of speckly areas where there's no color. And so the areas where that red is being deposited on the canvas corresponds with the white areas here in my texture, and the little speckles, the places where no color is being deposited, corresponds with the areas on my texture that are black. And I'm going to delete that. So let's pick another texture that's kind of reversed that. Here's one where we have mostly black, well, maybe half and half, I guess, but you have a lot of black and a lot of white. And so it lays down a slightly different texture. So let's go through the palette itself. Let's just look at some of the features. So this little invert checkbox actually inverts the values. So for example, if we go back to this guy here where it's mostly white with a little bit of black, if I hit invert, it will programmatically invert the value. So now that I have mostly black and a little bit of white, and so it changes sort of, the texture. Sometimes that can be helpful. Scale takes the bitmap here and scales it, so you can drop it down and make it repeat more frequently, which makes kind of a nice texture. Or you can scale it up and it will repeat less frequently, and the texture obviously will be larger as you paint. Mode, texture each tip, you'll want to keep that checked, because what that does is that actually tells Photoshop to pay attention to the pressure sensitivity of your stylus. So make sure that's checked. You almost always want to have that checked, because you kind of want to have a little bit of pressure sensitivity in your texture. Mode, these are blending modes, just like your layer blending modes, which you may or may not know about and which we will cover later. But and you can, what I would suggest if you want to have a little bit of fun, just select each one of these blending modes and see what it does to your texture. I usually keep it on multiply. Sometimes I do subtract. Actually, I never do subtract. I always do multiply. What does darken do? And you can obviously see what's going on down here in the preview. I like multiply. Depth. Depth basically determines how, well, there's depth and minimum depth. And these two settings determine how pronounced or how much effect the bitmap texture has on your brush. And so if you want a lot of texture showing through, you crank both of those sliders up to 100% and you'll see a lot of texture. If you want something that's a little more subtle, if you want the texture to appear a little more subtly in your brush, then you drop those down to a low percentage. And see, just the texture is a little more subtle. And depth and minimum depths have a slightly different effect on how the texture or the bitmap is sort of affects your brush stroke. They each have a slightly different, and that's fairly subtle. And I would just suggest, once again, coming into this part of the brush palette and playing with these sliders to see how each one of those affects the way the texture is displayed in your brush stroke. Depth jitter adds a variable, adds yeah, it varies it. It varies, it randomizes, that's the word I'm thinking of. It randomizes sort of the depth of the texture. It randomizes how pronounced the texture it shows up in your brush stroke. I don't know if you want to how much you want to randomize that, but you can play with that as well. So, hey, I did it under 6 minutes. So there is the texture palette, or the texture function in the brush palette.